Let's start with willpower. What is it? What is willpower, by the way? People throw this word around. I don't think they know what willpower is. And I don't think you could come up with the definition now if I asked you. And if you don't know what it is, how do you know that you need more of it? Because here's one of the interesting things that I find, and I did a little poll within my clients a few weeks back, because I hear this a lot, that I need more willpower. That's the thing that fucks me up. And that kind of suggests then that people who do well have more willpower. And I think you notice, whatever this willpower thing is, you notice when you're using it, right? You notice this, let's call it this feeling of resisting temptation. I just won't have it. I just won't have it. And to have more willpower then suggests that you're able to put up with that feeling for longer, right? You've got more willpower. You can resist more. And that would then suggest that people who get into shape spend just as long or more, because they're able to tolerate more, of their time resisting food. And it's just not true. It doesn't happen. Every time I speak to clients, none of the successful ones tell me that they knuckle their way through each day, constantly resisting food. If anything, it gets easier. It's not that they never have to resist things. That's not true either. But they do not feel like they're constantly resisting, and they do not ever use the term willpower. Ever. I don't think any one of them. And when I ask, what do you think your success is down to? None of them say willpower. So how come everyone keeps thinking willpower is this thing holding them back, when none of the successful people attribute it to willpower? Perhaps the successful people were born with naturally, greater amounts of it and they take it for granted. Maybe a little bit, but I doubt that because, they wouldn't have come to me if they were already in shape. So these are people who let themselves not get in shape and then changed. So they clearly didn't have that willpower to begin with, or they weren't using it, and they struggled just like everyone else does. So I don't think that's right. I enjoy eating a balanced diet and not overeating. Well, you do and you don't, right? And I don't know whether I touched on this at some point, but you have conflicting needs within yourself. Part of you wants the self-respect and self-worth that comes with looking better, because every human being cares about how attractive they are. It's built into the DNA. Peacocks and Kim Kardashian exist for a reason. Makes up a part of all of us. Another part of us wants to eat food. Well, a large part of us wants to eat food. And food serves a couple of purposes. There's a fuel aspect. There's, offsetting hunger. And then there's food is pleasurable, and you have needs for pleasure. Or we can call it needs to feel better. Or maybe even we can use food to escape negative emotion slightly. Because, it provides temporary pleasure. And any temporary pleasure is an escape from negative emotion, right? Negative emotion comes about because it motivates you. That's what the word motivation comes from. Motion. Emotion says the same thing. They're both motions. They're both drives that move you towards something or away from something else. And negative emotions evolved because they're a good way of getting an organism to go away from what they're currently doing. And positive emotions evolved because they reward you for things that are successful. That's why you experience positive emotion when you achieve something. But you have conflicting needs, and they don't all agree. And so you can have this thing where you have a need to escape the negative, and negativity has a bunch of different characteristics. Boredom is not a positive. Loneliness is not a positive. Sad, you can break it down to a bunch of things, and perhaps there's relationship-based ones within there. No one can sit with that for a while, and sometimes people use food, sex, drugs, or rock and roll as a way of escaping that pain. But it doesn't address the root issue. And you're going to be bored again. You're going to be lonely again. You're going to need something there. And if you've then been using food for an extended period of time as a way of filling that hole, excuse the pun, what happens when you're not allowed to use food anymore? Well, then you have to experience that negative emotion. That's not always easy. And it's not just a case of just use willpower, because we just touched on. That's not real. What is that? Well, instead, you reduce the amount of willpower you need. And you do this in a bunch of different ways. 1, you need to make sure that you eat food that you actually like eating. 2, you make sure you socialize in a manner that doesn't just involve all the wine and all the cheesecake, because you have need to hang out with friends. That might be awkward because it might mean you've spent years acting in a certain manner with your friends, and you're going to need to have an awkward conversation with them and tell them what you're doing. And when you tell people what you're doing, sometimes people can react to that in a bunch of different ways. Sometimes they don't like it, because when you improve your actions, you automatically cast a light and cast a shadow onto other people's. And they might not like what they see when they think that, in which case they can do a bunch of different things. They might start slagging you off behind your back. Who she thinks she is, what's this person doing? They might try and sabotage your plans, at least for a little bit. So they'll keep offering you drinks. Oh, it doesn't matter, all this thing. And, maybe they're also just used to that's how you guys hang out. Now you're altering their friendship, and they didn't sign up for you to do this. Now, if they're good friends and they're people who can deal with that little internal voice of jealousy and resentment that everyone has, then they will still continue to support you, and they won't see it as that because you're not doing it for those reasons. But you can't stop them interpreting it in that way, but you can have a conversation with them and explain, and then you act accordingly. So you need some social interaction, and that might mean changing your social interaction slightly, and that might mean taking the bull by the horns and you leading from the front and being like, guys, let's go and do this. And it might be something different, and that might make you feel awkward if you're not used to putting your neck out. But if you don't, and you keep being led down the path you've already been going down, you don't like yourself very much then. So guess what? There's lose-lose somewhere in here as well, or there's a win-win. You can look for the positives and negatives in every situation. You should look for the positives more. It's easier to notice the negatives. Human beings have a negativity bias for good reason. It makes more sense if you evolved to notice risks than if you didn't. Like if there's a little rustling in the grass on the savannas of Africa, it's better that you think, oh, that could be a lion, than it's probably just the wind. It probably is just the wind most of the time, but all it takes is one lion and your ass is getting eaten, in which case your genes don't get passed on. So people who made it were likely more hardwired to notice threats, which gives us this negativity bias, so that when you hear 100 compliments and 1 insult, you remember the insult, but it's not necessarily reflective of total reality. It's just part of the biology that makes you up, has a disposition towards noticing that, but it isn't correct, and therefore you shouldn't just listen to it. So you should look for the positive. Now, so there's a couple of things. So you've got food. You need to make sure you eat things that you actually like. You need to be able to socialize with friends in a manner that doesn't just slip you up and fuck you up and move you away from your other thing, because doing that makes you feel shit about yourself, as you've just touched on. You need to find things that you can do so you're not just bored the whole time, and that's a whole life thing. Because, well, there's a certain level of boredom that everyone needs to be able to deal with, but I think everyone knows that, so I don't know that I'm telling you anything new there, but well, what else do you have if you remove that time when you just sit around and do stuff? Now, that could be as simple as you make a rule for yourself that you do not eat mindlessly. You do not just sit there whilst, unless you've planned it for the cinema or something like that, that when you have a meal, you sit down for the meal. You don't just nibble in between meals. It's a really simple rule, but rules are good. That as long as we think of them as not being completely set in stone, they can be quite helpful. Then there's a conceptual thing that I think comes down to the willpower thing, and you kind of hinted towards it. I just need to get up and go do something when I feel the thought coming into my head to have a few snacks. There's a conceptual shift, and there's some cool research on this that showed, so there's a thing called implementation intentions, and an implementation intention is an if this happens, then I will do that strategy, right? So if then, call it an if then strategy. So if Doreen in the office comes and offers me a donut, then I will say no, then I will do bleh, right? And because, look, you start with a plan, but a plan needs to be malleable because life happens and other people have other plans and they don't always perfectly marry into your plans. And you need to be able to adjust to them slightly without ruining your whole progress. This is what if-then strategies are useful for, because it turns out people, when they start really thinking these things through, can usually come up with the scenarios that they get wrong the most. And they're the ones that obviously that need addressing the most. And then we can talk about different types of strategy. So there's one that's called just a merely negative strategy. So that if Doreen in the office comes and offers me a donut, then I will say no. It's one type of strategy. And it turns out that's better than not having a strategy. People who have a strategy do better in those situations because they've thought about it and they, have planned for it. And in some respects, when you think and plan through something, you experience what it's like. That's the evolutionary purpose of thinking, is it allows you to test out ideas without you having to experience them. That can be a potentially life-saving adaptation from an evolutionary perspective. So thought is great in that sense. So when you think something through, it has an actual effect on you. That's a merely negative one. Just say no. Second one is a replacement strategy. This is more effective than a purely negative one. If Doreen comes and offers me a donut, then I will not just say no, but I will have the protein bar I have in my bag, or the apple I have with me, or the whatever. And so rather than just saying no, I'm replacing that with a better choice that I like and still moves me towards my goal of looking better. Those two are more effective than, not having any strategy, and the replacement is more effective than the negative strategy. And you kind of know that, like if everyone's having cake around you, sometimes it helps, even if you're not having cake, having something feels better than just sitting there staring at cake and being like, fuck. And it helps even more if you like the thing you've chosen to eat. Like, a protein bar isn't as good as, a full chocolate bar, or Halo Top ice cream isn't quite as good as Ben & Jerry's, but it's got a shitload less calories in it. I can look better as a result, and I do genuinely like eating it. I don't really feel like I'm missing out particularly then. Whereas if I'm having nothing, I know I'm still missing out. I think that's why. Final one is a conceptual shift, and I think this is what happens in those people who are successful and why they don't feel they need willpower. And if Doreen comes to the office and offers me a donut, then I will remind myself that eating that donut won't help, that it contains a crap load of calories, and then I'm going to have to be hungry for the rest of the day, and I want to be in shape and feel better. Then you don't see the donut as this thing to resist temptation, or at least you recognize that it's not just temptation, that it's actually not that useful to you, that it's, I don't want to say bad for you in a complete moral sense, but it's bad in the sense that it won't help you get towards your goal. And that means it doesn't require as much willpower, because it's not just a temptation then. It's a thing that has a negative consequence attached to it. It turns out you don't want to do things that have negative consequences attached to them as much, but you have to then notice and acknowledge it. Because you could just notice and acknowledge that, it's delicious though. You have to notice the other side to that. And that way you will require less willpower. So I think they're the things to work on. So let me know what you think about just those thoughts to begin with, and how you think you might be able to implement them. And let's flesh this idea out.